be talking tonight about improving pastures, soil testing, fertilizing, seeding, pasture management, and a few other things. And Troy is really knowledgeable. He both has the information as from an academic background with some of his studies, but also farms himself up in northeast Minnesota and has a lot of great experience in managing pastures. However, we did want to give you a quick update on the FSMA produce rules. So the Food Safety Modernization Act is a new requirement for produce farmers across the United States that may be impacting you if you're a fruit or vegetable producer. There are some new requirements for produce growers from the FDA related to worker health, soil amendments, wildlife and animals, water, post-harvest handling and sanitation, kind of those good agricultural practices. And the goal is to reduce illness in the people that are consuming our products and protect your farm should there be an outbreak. You know, obviously we want to prevent an outbreak. That's the big goal, because if that happens, it can really be devastating for farms. So we'll be rolling out some education here in Minnesota. There are some training requirements, and there are some training requirements for some people who do not have an exemption. There are a bunch of exemptions for the size of your farm, the amount of income from the farm, that kind of thing. But even if you do have an exemption, there are some requirements. And so there's going to be some trainings going on. There are trainings going on right now in Minnesota for farmers that this rule applies to. In the slide here, there's a webinar from the Produce Safety Alliance, that's the PSA, that shares that the exemptions and information about that. We've got a number of websites where you can go to find more information about this program. The safety.cfans.umn.edu has some of the training information and other gaps information. The Department of Ag has some of the training programs that are coming up. Produce Safety Alliance is kind of the nationwide resource center where you can find a lot of excellent detailed information about the rule and what it requires. So I encourage you to check those things out, and I'll put some of these links in the chat so you can better access them should you want to. So, all right, I'm going to switch over to you, Troy.
Good evening. My name is Troy Salzer, and I have the opportunity to be a local educator in northeastern Minnesota in the community of Carlton and Cloquet, Moose Lake. And in this area, probably one of the most underutilized components of our agriculture community is pastures. And with that in mind, it's really become a passion of mine, not only as an extension person to get out and help folks in all species areas, but also in my own farming activities here in the community where our family raises predominantly beef cattle. We have been doing that here for about 20 years. We started with a very small herd, and over time have built that up. I pride myself and our family in relationship to implementing many of the components that we're going to talk about this evening. As far as why it's so important, it really revolves around the aspects of how costly feed is. If we look at beef cattle, for example, in sheep operations, it's about 65 to 70% of all costs that are affiliated with raising these livestock. In certain operations, dairy, stocker operations, it's a little bit less, but still there's a significant cost associated with feed. And so if there's ways in which we can reduce that, it really helps in relationship to saving money. In relationship to livestock grazing. Oftentimes, these are areas which are underutilized. They cost us a lot of money, and if there's a way to better utilize them, we can take advantage of that. And in many cases, the livestock have the ability to navigate them and minimize erosion if we're converting cropland as such. This here is a very good example of a very underutilized area. Perhaps it was too rocky to utilize or whatever that might be, and could easily capture some value from it. In this particular case, I'm going to pass it back to Jake, and he's going to go ahead and look at this. Have that, Jake?
Yep.
Perfect.
All right, so should have a poll available. You can answer how many years you've been grazing. So it looks like I always forget that it takes like 20 seconds when you say close poll, and it gives you 20 seconds. So waiting for that. So you should be able to see the results of the first one. You see those, Troy?
Very good. Thank you.
And then I've got another question. What type of livestock do you have? If you don't have any livestock, maybe you can do the other. Poll is going to close in about 9 seconds. As you can see, we've got a number of beef producers, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, and possibly a number of folks that do not have cattle.
Fabulous.
All right,
Thank you.
Back to you. Should have control.
Very good. Thank you. So from that understanding, from my perspective, there's a lot of good reasons to look at pastures as an option, in that we can produce a much higher quality feed, potentially in some cases, just because we can do a better job at harvesting when it's at its optimum quality as compared to in relationship to baling it or chopping it, and so from that standpoint, there's benefits that way. Pasture can be a low-cost option depending on the value of the land, so that it can work well in that respect. Graze forages can be higher quality than stored forages, primarily because you have less leaf loss, and therefore it'll give you better performance of the animal and more output per acre. And then we have the potential to do some grazing season extension and not have the costs associated with actually doing that harvest. In relationship to the livestock, you know, they spend a fair bit of time every day actually consuming. They also do some chewing of their cud, and in relationship to this, it is a very nice environment for them to actually be doing that in comparison to perhaps in a feedlot where they don't get as much exercise and what have you. Some of the grazing management components that I like to think about is that in general, approximately half of your pasture actually is below the soil. So in many cases, because it's not visible to us as humans, just by walking through the pasture, we often forget about that. And the analogy that I like to share with people is that, in essence, half of your plant is above ground, half of it is below ground. And with that in mind, we need to think about those roots, allow those plants to grow to perhaps a little bit larger height, more maturity, and will give those roots a better opportunity to capture both nutrients and moisture down in there. And then it's also really important to be sure to leave some leaves behind, especially in the cases of grasses, because they actually have the ability to photosynthesize and regrow more quickly if that is the case. There are two basic types of grazing systems. There's the continuous grazing. That's where you put the livestock out in a pasture at the beginning of the season, and you leave them set in that pasture until you run out of forage or you need to begin feeding feed in fall or supplementing feed in fall with that sort of situation. The other type is the use of rotational grazing. This can take many different shapes and forms. You can be as simple as just a two pasture system, moving the livestock back and forth amongst the two, up to very complex systems where you may be moving them multiple times a day in some cases, depending on what your goals are of your operation, and perhaps some strategy in relationship to that. So currently, a question that I was interested in finding out is whether or not you're rotating your animals in your current system.
So you just press the green check for a yes and the red X for a no for that one.
Thank you.
Like there's a little bit of a mix, and some folks that don't have their animals but are interested. So.
Okay. Fabulous. Thank you. Good. Well, for those of you that are, you've experienced many of the components of the benefits of using rotational grazing. And hopefully, as we continue to go through this, there might be some information that would help you to consider this as an option for you in the near future. Some of the benefits of rotational grazing is that the pasture productivity can be increased pretty dramatically. And that's primarily because you're giving the plants a rest period to recuperate. Plants are similar to children. As they go through the course of the day, especially young children, they need to take a nap. And Jake, in my case, I need to do that from time to time as well. And so I think that those plants really do need that opportunity to recover so that they can continue to grow well into the future and create more resiliency in relationship to that. It also will allow the plant forage to be more uniform in nature, And so therefore, when the livestock do graze it, it'll be more consistent as far as its quality and more productivity in relationship to that. It also helps the animals that are grazing it graze it more uniformly, and there'll be less waste, but also it will remain more consistent as far as how much material is there after you get done grazing. Simple rotation systems can be an improvement over continuous grazing. And if we look at this, I like to try to get producers to start with a simple 5-paddock system. But what I have found is after folks have implemented a 5-paddock system, they begin to continue to further break down the system into more paddocks to be able to manage it better. 5-paddock system is a system where the animals graze for a week, and then the other 4 paddocks are allowed to rest for 4 weeks. Each of the pasture, for some targets, we'd like to have them on there less than 7 days each, and rest periods generally in spring when the grass is growing more aggressively. We need to think about it in relationship to having a rest period of 2 to 3 weeks. As the season goes on, the grasses grow not quite as fast. Grasses can shut down at higher temperatures, and so we need to think about a longer rest period of maybe 4 to 8 weeks. These are very flexible. Generally in spring, we like to move through the pastures much quicker, and we'll actually start grazing the forage when it's pretty immature so that we can keep up with that very rapid, fast growth during that period. The next series of slides here is actually a case study that was in my county. This here particular pasture is a very droughty soil. It's called Omega 188, fairly low organic matter. And I work with this producer, and this is how it started. You can see a lot of open, bare ground. In this case, this is mature standing grass, a tremendous amount of open soil here. Here's another photo where we see manure pats that haven't decomposed, primarily because the sun is probably baked to the point where the soil biology isn't functioning very well. And so there isn't that opportunity for that manure pats to actually get broken down and down into the soil. The next photo is a photo taken within 5 days of when I took the other photos on the same exact soil type, approximately 5 miles by a crow from the other site. And this was a situation where the farmer has invested a fair bit in reseeding and also has implemented a grazing system. You can see the sward is extremely thick and dense. This here is a little bit more mature forage. This next photo is of some less mature forage that had been grazed approximately a week before the photo was taken, a lot lighter green in color just because of its maturity. And then this here is where the livestock are currently grazing. And this is a photo of myself here and an NRCS technician that was out looking with me at this particular site, just really admiring how much more forage. In this case, we did a scissor clip on both sites. This here particular site was yielding just approximately 2 tons of dry matter for that grazing. and in that other case, it was about 1/4 of a ton per acre. And this here had a lot better, most likely had a lot higher protein and energy levels in it compared to the other. So that's in just one harvest, and then if we take that into consideration, probably 2 to 3 harvests in one season, it's a dramatic amount of forage, comparatively speaking. To implement these systems, one of the first things that I think about, actually even before fence, is what sort of options do we have for watering these livestock? If we're going to divide them into new pastures, probably the most difficult thing to be concerned with is where are we going to get water? In these cases, these are livestock ponds. In both cases, you can see they're excluded. And most likely things like pumps, solar pumps, nose pumps, all are options to get gravity flow systems, ways in which to get water out of these, and at the same time keep the quality of the water up from that standpoint. Another option that is being utilized quite widely is poly pipe. In different cases, they utilize different sizes depending on how many livestock are in the pasture, so that we can supply enough water to them throughout the course of the year. In the summertime, when it's very hot, we have to have more than adequate water for the livestock to drink. This here is an example of the poly pipe running over ground. Oftentimes we locate it by the fence so that there's some protection. Other folks actually do a shallow bury to help with having this line impacted in relationship to that. This is an example of a quick coupler system, which is the hose hooked up to a tank. It is very flexible. You can have these couplers throughout your pasture, and it's very simple. You just hit this quick coupler button, it releases, and then it gives you a chance to attach it to a tank like this. Very simple, 1/2 of a 55-gallon drum with a high volume float here. And you have the ability to turn these tanks over very easily, clean them out, and move it from spot to spot. This here works well for a smaller group of animals, especially if they don't have large intakes. But if it gets to be hot and you've got a lot of animals that are traveling a fair amount of distance, you may want to consider a larger tank, something like this, where this farmer takes this from location to location and sets that up so that the livestock have more than adequate water. This is another option commercially available, another high volume float, and it's allowed to be transported pretty easily. The other thing I really like about the pipeline system, you can see that we had some damage here. These heifers perhaps tipped over the water and mucked this up. With a pipeline, it gives you the flexibility to adjust where it is, where the watering trough is located. And so, yeah, I don't necessarily like this, but it happens. The livestock tip it over, valve breaks, whatever it might be. And if you move the water trough the next time and not locate it in this spot, by the next year you won't even see this. It'll come back very rapidly and repair itself. Next, fencing options. When I think about fence, I immediately go to the perimeter fence. You might want to think about the what is a legal fence, and if that is the approach that you would like to take, there are certain standards and us as educators have the ability to get that information for you. I probably want to draw your attention more to the compatibility with the livestock that you're raising. With sheep or goats, even chickens, we want to be aware the woven wire fence is probably a better option in relationship to that. And in our area, we have to think about predators, especially wolves, coyotes, neighbors' dogs, those sort of things. And we have some ways in which to help mitigate any pressure from those critters on our livestock based on what type of perimeter fence we decide to choose. Then we have the interior aspects, the interior fencing. It's generally less of a concern for us in relationship to if a critter is able to move forward in a pasture, it really is less of an issue from that standpoint. But in this process, I encourage farmers to avoid that occurring too much, because we want to make sure that the livestock that we're working with do have respect for the fence, so that they don't so-called move themselves from pasture to pasture as compared to you moving them from paddock to paddock. And then the other component I like is flexibility. There's some benefits to having permanent interior fencing, but I also like utilizing things like polywire and such. These here are some examples of different types of what I'd consider perimeter fence. This is poly tape for horses. It's very visible. It's fantastic from that standpoint. Fairly expensive. Another option is our standard barbed wire fence with very close spacing on posts, fairly expensive to put up. Woven wire fence with a strand of barb on the top. Great predator fence. Works really well for small livestock that can't, calves can't crawl through it. Goats don't tend to get through it, so that's a really nice fence. Probably the most expensive out of all of these, about $2 a foot. And then this here is an example of high tensile fence. Posts are a little bit further apart. Very easy to maintain from the standpoint of being able to tighten those up. As far as permanent interior, and what I mean by permanent is that it can be left up, and generally it's more of a 2 or a 3 strand system. Even in some cases I've seen a fair bit of 1 strand high tensile electric. These here are a fiberglass post. This is an example of 2 strand high tensile with wood posts, and then here's some poly tape on this permanent interior fence. These here are what I would consider temporary interior fences, so you can take them down, put them up. This here in the bottom left corner, this is a set of our cattle, just a single strand of poly wire. We utilize that for daily moves, and so it's really easy for my boys and I to go out there and move that ahead in our particular system. Especially in our case, we've converted some crop ground into pastures, so we made them long and narrow, and it works quite efficiently that way. So here's another in some cuir clover, single strand. Here's a double strand. Generally with sheep and goats, you usually see 3 or 4 strands like this. Some folks have really good luck with that. I have a lot more producers that are using the ElectroNet. This stuff works really well for pigs and chickens, as well as the sheep and goats. The goats, sometimes you got to watch them. The key to it is making sure you keep it very electrified. Check it frequently. Otherwise, sometimes the goats will stick their head through, and if they've got horns, they'll get caught on the ElectroNet. And so my caution is just to make sure that it's well energized at all times. So that was kind of this infrastructure associated with doing rotational grazing. The next item that I would focus on as far as an investment goes would be on fertility. In this case, fertility really is part of the system that allows the plants to grow. And if we have a situation where the nutrients in the soil are deficient, that first level of deficiency is going to be the most limiting factor in relationship to the amount that those plants are going to grow. So from my perspective, the first thing you should do in relationship to consideration of adding soil fertility is to go ahead and get a soil test to get started and give you an understanding of where you're at in relationship to that. And then we can get information from the fertilizer recommendation guide for agronomic crops in Minnesota. It's a university publication there. And if you just Google that, you'll be able to find that if you haven't written it down at this point. So the next question I have for you is, have you soil tested your pastures in the past? Okay. Well, I guess we have some opportunities here in relationship to getting out there and soil testing. So taking soil samples it's a fairly easy process. It's best to utilize either a soil probe or a simple garden spade. We would like to take the soil to a depth of approximately 6 inches because that's the typical root growing zone. And we go around your pasture collecting about 10 to 15 cores throughout the entire area. We like to avoid certain spots where livestock might hang out more frequently, such as around watering sites, beneath shade trees, or if in the past you've adjusted the soil pH, so stay away from areas that might have been higher levels of manure or lime in that particular case as you go about collecting that sample. This here is an example of a University of Minnesota soil testing lab test results. On the top here, you can see it's basically a bar graph. They wanted to illustrate what the particular nutrients that were evaluated from what they consider very low to very high. And so in the case of organic matter at 3.4%, they would consider that a medium concentration. pH at 6.1, also kind of little bit low, and perhaps would like to increase that a little bit. Bray phosphorus of 21, you can see that that stacked almost to the very high level, and the potassium at 27 is in the low or very low category, as well as the boron in the very low category as well. As we think about managing our pastures, especially if we want to look at including legumes, specifically maybe some alfalfa, some of the red clovers. The ideal range is basically that 6.5 to 7. And part of the reason for that is, as we look at this figure, as the line for a particular nutrient gets wider or thicker, it's more available naturally. So if we look at phosphorus, for example, as we get very low or acidic, and as that goes up over 6.0, the soil phosphorus, the phosphorus that is actually in the soil becomes more available for the plant to take up. In many cases, as we go lower in pH, many of the nutrients become less and less available, and hence the reason why so much liming is done at least in our region of the state. In other parts of the state, you have more alkaline soils, and adjusting the pH is probably not as important. But in my region, it's probably the first thing we need to think about if we are going to be trying to grow some of the legumes. If you don't have a reasonable priced lime available to you, or your pastures due to rocks or due to trees, they don't allow it, then if you want to introduce some legumes, you'll need to think about some of the options as far as what will grow or what will tolerate lower soil pHs, such as bird's foot trefoil, for example. The next nutrient that is probably the most deficient in most of our soils is nitrogen. Specifically, if we're going to be growing predominantly a grass-based mixture, its primary role is to grow top or leaves, and it is one of the components that really feeds the crude protein content of your grasses. It's also, in essence, energy for root growth as well. And some of the strategies I'd recommend in relationship to nitrogen applications, split applications, are most beneficial. Generally, we like to look at 2/3 for spring growth and 1/3 for fall growth on our grasses, as that's approximately the proportion of forage that they'll generate. More in spring, less in fall from that standpoint. Depending on where you're at in the state, I'd recommend somewhere between 40 and 80 pounds of total annual application. Looking early in the season, somewhere in some of your parts, maybe as early as April. In our area, more in the June, and then look at the second application more in the August time frame. With a grass legume mixture, you can reduce that number down to about 60 pounds annually. The potassium and phosphorus, or P and K, for phosphorus and potassium, this is more important for your legumes. It gives the plants winter hardiness, and it is very, very critical in red clover and alfalfa specifically. This is where the soil test very quickly pays off. It gives you the opportunity to more strategically invest your money in whatever nutrient is the lowest. So in our particular example, the potassium was quite low, and so I would recommend spending more of your dollars for fertilizer on the potassium as compared to the phosphorus. Generally speaking, annual phosphorus applications range from 0 to 70, and potassium 0 to 230. Generally speaking, it's more in the middle of that sort of range based on what I typically see out in the field. And with these, you can apply all of it in spring. You don't have to do split applications because of the risk of nitrogen leaching is much higher than the phosphorus and potassium. Generally, it's best if you apply fertilizer in early spring. Majority of the plant growth will take effect in May and June, and so having those nutrients there early will give you better growth. And then in some cases, you may need to consider utilizing both sulfur and boron additionally, especially when you get into the case of some of our more higher producing legumes in relationship to that. Next, after you look at what has occurred with your fertilizer, if things haven't started to blossom in relationship to that, you may want to think about some seeding options. The three types, kind of the traditional seeding with traditional renovation. It is something that generally is more expensive. Interseeding is another option, less expensive. And then frost seeding, very little invasiveness and risk of erosion, but may be less successful in that respect. Traditional is definitely most successful. It is by far and away more expensive, probably in the tune of about 3 times as much. But depending on how many rocks and trees and that sort of stuff, it really may not be an option for you in relationship to that. And depending on what species you're introducing, you may want to think about that being your best option as far as that goes. Interseeding, we have an interseeder that we rent out in our office. We've become more successful with it over time. But some of the keys to success is making sure that you've got the seeder set to the correct depth, and you need to control the competition. That can be with either application of an herbicide, or other options include utilizing the livestock to chew it down and creating that competition early. And then it's really important to select a species that has great seedling vigor, such as red clover, orchard grass, ryegrass, as being good at being successful if there's much for competition. Excuse me. It is a little bit less expensive, and especially with an interseeder, if you take your time, even if there is some rock out there, you should be able to maneuver that from that perspective. And then finally, frost seeding. It's extremely variable. The 2 types I would recommend would be either red clover or bird's foot trefoil. It's something that you must stick with from year to year, because one year it'll be successful and then it might not be successful for another 2 or 3 years. So it's advised to keep after it. Excuse me. It can be mixed with the fertilizer, but if you do that, make sure that you get it out in a timely fashion and spread within a couple hours of when you mix it. And so it's advised to go out and do that. Generally, you'd like to have a little bit of snow cover so that that freeze and thawing occurring in your soil surface allows for that seed to get down into the grass stand or into the thatch, so that you can get good soil to seed contact. And generally, I'd consider it a fairly low-cost option. from the standpoint of getting that out and taken care of. With that in mind, I would like to take a few questions, and so to avoid not having that opportunity, Jake, I would love to actually stop at this point, and that way we give folks an opportunity to ask questions about these different topics that we've covered at this point.
Yeah, great. So folks, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll try to get to those. We did have one, an individual was asking about growing sainfoin or sainfoin, a legume here in Minnesota. Troy, do you have any experience or knowledge on that legume?
Yes, sainfoin is a legume that generally requires even a higher pH. Ideal pHs for that particular legume would be more in that 7.5 to about 7.8 pH range. Some of the attributes that sainfoin has been claimed to have is its drought tolerance is better than our clovers, for example. And it is a fairly low user of nutrient as well compared to a productive alfalfa stand.
I saw some information that Craig Schaefer with the University of Minnesota had done some writing about sainfoin and was saying that the productivity in Minnesota tends to be a lot lower, probably related to the pH issue. So good question. Other questions, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, maybe everybody knows everything now, Troy.
I highly doubt it. There are many of the components in this presentation that could have been broken down into full sessions by themselves. Yep. One of them being pasture renovation as such.
Right. I will mention that I put a number of links. I put those links related to the FSMA produce rule in the chat. So if you wanted to get to those in a more easy fashion, those are there. I also put some videos that our small farms team created with extension on grazing systems. So some information on fencing and watering systems for rotational grazing programs. So those are there in the chat. Otherwise, you can find our small farms YouTube just with a Google search and find that information. There might be one here in the Q&A.
I see that there is another question there, Jake, in relationship to perception as far as pasturing in wooded areas. This is a bit of a controversial conversation in some cases, especially in my region where the forestry industry is very productive and is used by industry to produce paper and OSB and different products like that. And what we have found is as we do a better job managing our pastures, there's less and less impact on the forest growth, less compaction under the trees, and generally speaking, as we increase that level of management, you get to a point where the folks that are concerned about tree productivity find that there really is not much impact to the forest whatsoever with the livestock grazing underneath there. It also, in some cases, opens it up and reduces the amount of competition, especially in the case of species like goats and sheep that are more browsers, perhaps, as compared to beef cattle, dairy cattle, horses, so on and so on.
I put a link to our agroforestry program from Extension in the chat as well, and you can find some information, more information about grazing cattle along with forest products there. So please check that out. We have a question about frosts and winter frost seeding with clover. Any thoughts or recommendations there, Troy?
This time of the year is almost the ideal time. Different parts of the state perhaps have too much snow right at this point to do the frost seeding. Generally speaking, I advise people to increase the seeding rate by about 15 to 25% as they go out and do that spreading. Some of the spreaders, it helps a lot if you add some limestone to the seed so that you can get a good uniform distribution. Another thing that I've done personally is I went out and purchased hay that was very mature in red clover seed, and as I graze that, I move the or have the bales placed in such a fashion so that the livestock, in essence, cover that whole area. And I felt as if it was a great way for me to purchase seed and at the same time get good uniform distribution throughout that area. As long as you are willing to be flexible in relationship to the success from year to year, sooner or later a lot of that seed will germinate if you have patience. And in wooded areas, it's especially hard to get seed distributed, and so it really is your only option as far as getting legumes introduced under some of these forested areas or wooded areas.
Super. Well, we've had some good questions. We're getting towards the end. I'm going to, Troy, you want to pass me the ball and I can switch back to our other PowerPoint. All right. If you do have another question, please put it in the chat or the Q&A and we'll address them. So some things to do, you'll get the evaluation link in your inbox, and again, please do that. We really do appreciate your feedback and ideas. We also have a Facebook page, and that is there, so you can connect with us there, get some more updates, and interact if you like. If you are on Twitter, people to follow those. So RSDP is the Regional Sustainable Development Partnership within Extension. They're the kind of the umbrella group that helps organize that. And then UMN Small Farms, that's me on Twitter, and so you can connect with us there. Use a hashtag Foods Call It if you want to give us a shout out. And we hope that you can join us next week. We have next week is off because I believe it's caucus night. So we'll be doing this on the 13th instead, when we'll be talking about deep winter greenhouses with Carol Ford. It's a pretty cool project that some folks here in Minnesota are working on to really extend their growing season into winter using this kind of a new system for Minnesota of growing greens and some other things in the deep of winter. So hope we can make it there. We've got a number of other sessions. And then I don't know if you may or may not have been on the first webinar that we held, but if not, I just want to let you know that in previous years we've done 8 of these sessions all in a row. And this year we're trying to break it up a little bit because we tend to see that towards the end people are starting to drop off and just get busy with other things or lose interest. So we're trying to split them up. Later in the year we'll have another series of these. So we hope that you can continue joining us. And that is the website if you want to find some more information or last week's recording and find it there. So I don't believe I see, okay, what is this? Just a question on the scientific name of red clover. I don't have that offhand. I can look it up. Yeah, you would be right. Trifolium pratense should be it. Miranda. Let's see if there's any other questions. I don't think so. So I think that we are going to call it a night. I want to thank everyone again for joining us. If you can